So I want to begin with a story about what the First Amendment has meant in the United States. As most of those in this audience will know, it is the First Amendment to the United States Constitution that says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Now, for the first 140 years of American history, it might also surprise you that the Supreme Court of the United States never once struck down a government restriction on free speech under First Amendment grounds. 140 years. Routinely, anti-war protesters, labor activists, abolitionists were thrown in jail. Now, why did this happen? Part of it is your guys' fault here in England. We had to ask ourselves the question, what does the freedom of speech mean? And for most of American history, we took the Blackstonian approach, which was no prior restraints. So you could say whatever you want, but once you said it, we could throw you in jail, right? And indeed, 7 years after the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, the United States Congress passed the Sedition Act, which criminalized criticism of the president. Well, how did this manifest itself? Well, you have a gentleman named James Callender who was thrown in jail for calling John Adams, then the president, deranged. You have Franklin Bash, who was thrown in jail because he called Adams blind, bald, crippled, toothless, and querulous. So these are the early years of the First Amendment in the United States. Well, how did this change? That's the big question, right? Because that's not the First Amendment today. That's not the First Amendment that all of you know. It began with an organization called the Free Speech League that then transformed into the Civil Liberties Bureau. This is the early part of the 20th century. And that turned into an organization called the American Civil Liberties Union. These were campaigners for freedom of speech who did not like that early interpretation of the First Amendment. They had a broader interpretation of what the founders meant by freedom of speech. And they were able to enlist in the cause a Supreme Court justice named Oliver Wendell Holmes, who early in 1919 threw a bunch of socialists in jail for handing out anti-war leaflets opposing the draft. And then later in 1919, November, he changed his mind. This is called the Great Dissent in an Abrams case, where he dissented from the Supreme Court's throwing in jail other socialists in New York who handed out anti-war leaflets. What changed? Well, his friends got to him, and they made the argument for John Stuart Mill's approach to freedom of speech. This is the marketplace of ideas approach to freedom of speech. And over time, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes brought in another justice named Louis Brandeis, and the ACLU managed to expand the interpretation of what the First Amendment meant. Its first annual report was called The Fight for Free Speech. Its second annual report was A Year in the Fight for Free Speech. I have my own quarrels with how the ACLU has approached free speech in recent years. There were about 4 years in the 2010s where the free speech, those words were never once mentioned in any of its annual reports. But over time, the freedom of speech eventually grew in its protection, so much so that if you ask Americans today what their most precious right is, they'll say freedom of speech, even above religious liberty and the right to vote. I was recently reading a New York Times article where this chap, who you might know, I guess he's British, Matthew Goodwin, remarked that Americans have an almost religious-like commitment to free speech that is hard for foreigners to understand. And there are even some on the Supreme Court who say that the freedom of speech has become weaponized to strike down regulations that have nothing to do with speech. This is Justice Elena Kagan, who I happen to disagree with on that, but you get what I'm saying, right? Freedom of speech has evolved in America over time, and the First Amendment we know today was the result of a group of concerned citizens who didn't like anti-war protesters being thrown in jail, that didn't like labor organizers being thrown in jail. So laws and the Constitution is not enough. As Judge Learned Hand said in 1944, the spirit of liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, there's no Constitution, there's no law that can so much as save it. They have freedom of speech protections in the Constitution of Russia, China, and North Korea, but they mean nothing, just like they meant nothing in the United States of America for the first 140 years. So that's why the work of the Free Speech Union is so important. I think of you guys a little bit like the early ACLU, the Free Speech League, and the Civil Liberties Bureau. You can give new meaning to your free speech protections, just as we Americans did so as well.
Thank you very much.